Welcome everyone to the latest in a series of development and support webinars delivered by the NIHR Academy. My name is Lucy and I work at the NIHR Academy as the Senior Development and Support Manager. This webinar, Hybrid Working, is delivered in conjunction between the NIHR Academy and Capfinity, our leadership programme partners, and will be facilitated by Jean Burke. Jean has over 25 years experience working at a senior level in change management, communications and employee engagement. Jean has worked with NHS executives, clinicians, healthcare professionals and their teams to help them perform at their best and deliver better outcomes. Jean, I'll now hand over to you.
Many thanks, Lucy, and you're all very welcome to today's webinar on developing your hybrid working. And I'm delighted to be here as part of this webinar today. I really feel strongly about hybrid working and how we can get it. We can get it very right and we can equally get it very wrong. And we're going to talk today about how some factors that we need to consider when we're thinking about embedding a culture of hybrid working within our teams. So the first thing I wanted to do to get us started is just to anchor our conversation in the here and now and thinking about how did we get here? How do we get to a place of talking about hybrid working? And I was reading some really interesting research in the last few days. It said, interestingly enough, it said that it was from KPMG and it said 83% of global CEOs expect us all to be back in the office within a couple of years. And I have to say that's not the mood music I hear amongst my clients and the organizations I work with. It very much feels like hybrid working in some shape or form is here to stay. So let's ground it in how we got here in the first place. So the first thing to say is maybe to look back at some of the research around hybrid working and the percentage of employees that spend part of their working week at home, because that's what we're talking about when it comes to hybrid working. And the Office for National Statistics way back in 2019 did some research around this, and they found that a mere 4.7% of UK employees were spending part of their working week at home. A very small number of employees. We were very much focused on getting into the office, spending long days there and juggling our lives and our careers accordingly. Along came the pandemic. And similarly, the Office for National Statistics did some research again in 2020 when we were forced into either working from home or a hybrid working environment. And at that point, 47% of employees were quoting that they were spending at least part of their working week at home. So we might have thought at that point that post-pandemic things would go back to a normal. We might not get back to 4.7%, but it may land around the 20 or 30%. Interestingly, the Chartered Institute for Personnel and Development in 2023 revisited this subject and found that an astounding 60% of UK employees are now spending at least part of their weeks at home. And The Economist declared in 2022 hybrid work as a key phrase, in fact, the words of the year when it comes to the workplace and the working environment. So hybrid working is more than a business trend. It's very much seen as the future of work, regardless of the mood music that might be out there at the moment about organizations and institutions returning to face-to-face environments for work. So there's been a profound shift over the last 4 to 5 years on how we think about work. And some of the benefits of hybrid working are undoubtedly that they give us far more flexibility and an opportunity to just think differently about our ways of working. On that basis, it means that from a workplace point of view, we need to start thinking very differently about how we manage certain things within the workplace to maintain good working environments, ensure productivity, for example. And we are, over the course of our time together today, we're going to run through some of those key concepts that we need to be thinking about when it comes to hybrid working. And I'm sharing right now some images on the screen that relate to these four aspects that we need to consider. And you might be thinking right now, well, hang on a minute, we've always had an aspect of hybrid working within the NIHR. And probably, yes, within the NIHR and the healthcare sectors in particular, the very nature of the work has required it. But have we really looked at this in a more scientific fashion to think about the things we need to consider when it comes to the world of work in a hybrid environment? So there are four things that I want to take you through today when we're considering a hybrid working. The first is around comfort. And I don't just mean, there's an image up here of a crowded train, and we might be thinking, oh gosh, yes, those were the days when I was back commuting into work, the train was packed and it was really uncomfortable. So there's that kind of comfort that we're thinking about, but there's also how do we as leaders and as teams get comfortable with the whole concept of hybrid working? So we're going to be talking a little bit about that today. The second thing we're going to be talking about is community. So one of the big things that's come out of the hybrid working movement is that it can become more challenging for us to maintain a sense of community within the workplace, particularly with new people coming into the workplace and managing that culture accordingly. So we're going to be talking a little bit about how we maintain community when actually many of us are not meeting our colleagues on a regular basis, and how do we retain a culture that is very much the NIH culture in that context. The third thing we're going to be talking about today is connection. So I'm going to share with you some research around the impact that hybrid working is having on our ability to connect as human beings. And then fourthly, we're going to be talking about contribution. So how do we ensure employees, team members, colleagues really still feel a sense of contribution in the workplace when they are working remotely? So over the course of our time together today, I'm going to invite you to reflect on your own teams and your own ways of working. So I really encourage you to have a pen and paper to get close to hand so that you can do a little bit of reflection as we go through our conversation today. So the first thing I want to talk about is comfort. And comfort in two aspects. Firstly, what does comfort look like for us in terms of hybrid working? But also as senior leaders, how do we get comfortable with fostering an effective hybrid working environment? So making it work for ourselves and for our teams. So, it gives us flexibility and freedom, this hybrid working, but your flexibility and freedom might be very different to my sense of flexibility and freedom. So we really need to understand what drives that for us and for members of our team. So the first thing I wanted to talk about really is our preferences. And the slide I have up here shares some, I would say, continuums rather than either-ors. So as I'm going through this slide, I'm going to invite you just to think about where are you on the continuum? What's my preference when it comes to these different factors? So the first factor, for example, on the top of the screen, talks about social thinkers. So a social thinker is someone who likes to think out loud, likes to be amongst other people when it comes to getting good ideas, for example, versus an incubator who prefers to solve a problem on their own, to have quiet time to do some thinking. So are you a social thinker, or is your preference towards being an incubator? Are you the sort of person that loves to be amongst people? So you have a real fear of missing out if you weren't in the office? Or are you the sort of person that thinks, hurrah, I'm at home today, I don't have to talk to anyone, I can get my head down and do my work? So the second continuum here is the fear of missing out versus the joy of missing out. Then we move on to thinking about space. So I might be the sort of person who thinks home is a really busy place. I have no place that I can do my work quietly. So it might be really important for me to come into the workplace so that I can get on with my day job. There's a space there for me to do the work. The other aspect of this might be there's no space at work. There's no quiet space. There's great time for connection, but I can't get my head down and do the work. So again, am I the sort of person that needs space, or am I the sort of person that actually needs to be at home to create space? The next factor of continuum here is around whether I feel whether I have a belief really that together is better. It's much better for the team to be together, to bounce ideas, to work effectively together. Or am I the sort of person that has their head down and wants to concentrate? And then equally, do I feel that the culture within which I work needs me to show up and prove my productivity? Or actually, am I so caught up in the purpose of my work that that speaks enough for me? I don't need to prove productivity to anyone. So what I'm going to invite you to do right now is just spend 30 seconds on your own, capturing whether you are more on the odd numbers or more on the even numbers. So am I more of a social thinker than an incubator? Perhaps I'm the sort of person that feels I like to have a head down and concentrate versus together is better. So I'm going to stay silent for 30 seconds and just invite you to capture where are you on the continuum. And when you've done that, pop into the chat whether you have a majority of odd or even when it comes to your preferences. So odd or even. So I'm just going to put my timer on now for 30 seconds and leave you just to reflect on that and capture in the chat. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, thank you for that. So I notice in the chat, even in the group we have here together, that we have a variety. So I can hear, and it's great from the chat, that some people are saying it depends on the context and it depends on the work. But we have equal number of evens and odds, if that's not a contradiction. But even in our small group, it tells us that there is variety, and it will be the same for our teams. We may have preferences that are very different to our teams. So when it comes to helping people get comfortable with working in a hybrid fashion, then it's important we really need to understand their preferences. And in order to understand their preferences, there are some key questions that we could ask them. And again, in just a moment, I'm going to give you the opportunity to reflect on these yourselves. But there are 4 questions I've popped up on the screen right now. And this probably relates to what we've seen in the chat too already today. So which tasks or activities require you to be in a specific place, for example? What environment are you in when you feel you are working at your best? Where do you find it best to collaborate and have good conversations? And where do you feel most comfortable building relationships? So depending on how you respond to these questions, it's going to lean you towards being more or less comfortable with working in a hybrid environment. You may actually have a job that requires you to do a deep dive into lots of research papers and writing, in which case your preference might be to do that at home. You may be at a stage in which your work requires lots of collaboration, which would require you to be more in the office or face-to-face with people. So again, I'm going to give you 1 minute on your own just to capture again some very top line answers to these 4 questions. And also maybe think about one person in your team. How might they respond to these questions? And would it be different to how you respond to them? So 1 minute on your own to capture the responses to these questions. So 30 seconds left. So again, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and I'm going to get you to stop there. Now, I'm sure you haven't fully responded to those questions, but it's giving you food for thought around where your best work gets done, and also inviting us to think about our teams, our colleagues with whom we work, our peers. Where do they get their best work done? And is it different to us? So what assumptions might I be making about what's okay for me might not be okay for others? So overall, what I'm inviting you to adopt really is an air of curiosity when it comes to what is comfortable for people in terms of hybrid working. Their preferences need to come into it, but also the demands on them. What are the tasks that are being asked of them as part of their ways of working? I'm going to move us on now, if I may, to talk about the next of the C's. And this is about community. So hybrid working, a lot of the research is telling us that hybrid working has been shown to pose a threat to culture and community within teams and organizations. It's no great surprise, is it? We're spending a lot less time together, which is how culture and community gets developed and evolved, which means that we really have to work much harder at it. So although it does bring an immense amount of positives in terms of us balancing our work lives and our home lives, that there are some downsides to it that we need to consider when we're setting up our environments for hybrid working and effective team cultures. And February 23, the Chartered Management Institute did some research around hybrid working. And I just wanted to share at this point with you some of the findings around that are really interesting when it comes to building community. So the first one was around loneliness in workplaces, and the CMI found that 52% of employees said that hybrid working had made their workplaces more lonely. We can imagine it, can't we, that if the environment is quite empty, there might be certain people in on different days. We may not connect with people who are more akin to us and that we're likely to be more engaged with. Also, and interestingly, 44% of employees reported that hybrid working had made their jobs more stressful. There weren't the same cues available to them in terms of ways of working. They had to work harder and understanding the culture, perhaps, and didn't necessarily feel that strong sense of community that we might have had when we were all together in the office or in the healthcare environment, for example. The final point that came out from the research was around reduced socializing. So 70% of managers said that hybrid working had reduced work colleague socializing. Those informal opportunities, maybe at the end of the working day or in the lunch breaks, for example, were disappearing. And these are the things that help create and build a sense of community and culture within organizations. So we really need to start to think about how can we address these if these are some of the issues with hybrid working. Like I said, there's some great positives to it, but there are definitely downsides. And some of the things that were driving these results of the research were the following. I thought I'd share it with you just as food for thought as well. So the first is around social loafing, an interesting phenomenon that has arisen as a result of hybrid working. This sense that people might not be working as hard as I am because it's not as visible how hard people are working. And this sense of social loafing comes from this idea that if I have an idea that you're not going to work so hard, then why should I? So this can contribute to our declining sense of community within organizations. The second is around resentment. So a lack of transparency, I suppose, around what people are or aren't doing in the workplace. And also a bit of, I've certainly heard it in the environments I've been in, it's that a bit of presenteeism and a bit of, if I show up, I get the interesting projects. But if I work from home more, I am forgotten about, and I may not get the interesting projects or research themes to work on. And that is creating a sense of resentment amongst people. So we need to be aware of that as well when we're thinking about our culture and our community. And the final aspect is this piece around lack of control. Now, Michael West did a lot of work in the NHS research. He's an organizational psychologist, and his main work is around compassionate leadership. And he said one of the key things that drives engagement in the workplace, builds community and culture, is about employees feeling like they have the autonomy to get things done. And if I am the kind of leader that is worried about what my team are doing when I can't see them, then that can result in me exerting more control than I might otherwise need to. And if employees are feeling that they're being put upon in terms of control and they don't have autonomy, or they feel like their leaders are not trusting them to get on and do the work, they start to feel undermined and fear that they can't be trusted. And trust is such a key thing when it comes to building effective community and workplaces, more so than ever when it comes to hybrid working. And trust is an interesting concept, isn't it? Because trust, very hard to necessarily see it in action. But I can guarantee you, and I'm sure you can think about opportunities right now, situations right now where you have experienced a lack of trust in an organization or in a team. We might not know immediately how to create trust. It can take a lot of time, but we sure know when trust has been broken. And I wanted to share some theory with you right now. It comes from a book by Meister, Green and Galford called The Trust Equation. And they talk about some key aspects that build trust and can have a negative impact on trust. And the invitation, as I'm going through this framework right now, is to think about situations you've experienced where there's been a high degree of trust, and equally situations where trust has broken down. So Meister, Green and Galford talk about three key aspects that contribute to building trust. So having these in abundance creates trust. So the first of these is credibility. So if I feel that the person I'm working with is knowledgeable, understands what they're talking about, has the credentials and the experience in the work that they're doing, they're going to feel credible for me. And that is going to contribute to me feeling like I can trust them. The second aspect of trust is reliability. And this is about me feeling that when you say you're going to do something for me, you do it. So I can trust you to do as you say you will. And the third aspect of the trust equation is intimacy. And intimacy in this context is ultimately, is it safe for me to confide in you? Can I share with you what's going on for me? And if I feel I can, then I'm likely to feel more trust in you. So above the line, we have three contributing factors to trust: credibility, reliability, and intimacy. So they are all contributing factors. But the single most important detractor from trust is the degree to which we are focused on ourselves or the other. So, and this is what we call self-orientation. So if I feel that in any interaction or in any communication, you are more oriented towards self-interest than you are my interest, then that is going to have a massive impact on whether I feel I can trust you or not, irrespective of whether I feel you've got credibility or reliability, for example. So I'm just going to ask you to reflect again on your own for a moment about the amount of trust that you feel is in your team right now, be it high or low. And if you feel like it could be a little bit more than it is currently, What could you do in the area of self versus other orientation to help you demonstrate your focus on the other person, which in turn will help build trust within your team? So again, I'm just going to give you 1 minute on your own to think about, in the team within which I operate and function, where are we on the trust ladder? Are we high or are we low? It's probably a given that we have credibility, reliability, and intimacy. But where are we on self-orientation? Are we individuals focused on our own needs and agendas, or are we focused on the other? And if we are focused on the other, what can we be doing more of or less of to help build trust? So I'm going to give you 1 minute on your own just to think about that. And when you've done that, you might pop into the chat just 2 or 3 words, one thing you could do more of or less of to help build trust and that sense of community within your team. In 5 seconds, 4, 3, 2, 1. Just capture in the chat very quickly a few words about what you could do more of or less of when it comes to building trust. Great, love it. Show vulnerabilities, more open communication, more regular communication, more regular contact, communication and collaboration, encouraging teamwork. Great, thank you for that. And that's the next point we're going to go on to talk about, which is the whole area of connection and communication. So the third point, as I said, I wanted to talk about connection. And connection's an interesting one when it comes to hybrid working, because in some ways, through hybrid working and the technology that's evolved over the last 4 to 5 years, we are more connected than we have ever been before. Technology has allowed us to have all sorts of communication with people. Who knew that Zoom, Teams, all these different ways of meeting face-to-face would grow and develop as they have done in the last few years? That said, although technology has expanded and grown to help build connection, in a funny old way, actually hybrid working has had a real negative impact on our ability to develop our networks and have a real sense of social capital and a sense of feeling connected. And research tells us that increased positive social connection and feeling like we are part of something bigger plays a huge part in people's sense of well-being and their connectedness and productivity in the workplace. Equally, the converse is true, where the absence of social connection can lead to feelings of isolation, stress, disengagement, and even depression. So although we are more connected in the hybrid world than ever before because of technology, I'm wanting to sow a seed a little bit here about the quality of that connection and the quality of communication that we have in that hybrid context. We have a myriad of communication channels open to us these days that we probably weren't using in the same way pre-COVID, for example. So we have instant messaging, we have WhatsApp, we have emails, we have calls, we have meetings, we have Teams, we have Zoom, we have Google Meet, all these different channels. But they are not always appropriate for every form of communication. And my invitation for you now is just to think about your default form of communication in that hybrid workplace. When you go to communicate with members of your team or your peers, are you the sort of person that immediately takes to email? Are you the sort of person that speaks immediately to instant messaging, for example? Because It really has an impact on how a message might land. And let me give you an example of this that happened to me really recently. Having come back off holiday, I was inundated with an email inbox like we've all experienced, lots and lots of emails in it, some of which were requests for availability from me for work. And these emails had come in several times and I was trying to respond to them. And no sooner was I responding to the emails than I was getting a WhatsApp message trying to clarify something with me as well. I was feeling bombarded. I was trying to get through my inbox. I was trying to respond to people and be responsive, as responsive as I could be. But actually, the immediate communication of WhatsApp and instant messaging was getting in the way of me doing my work. And it was starting to make me feel a little bit short-tempered. So my response to people was probably not as good as it might have been. So there's a difference, isn't there, between our intention, which might be to get feedback from people on something, and the impact the type of communication or channel we use can have when it lands with the other person. So I want to share just a framework with you to think about when it comes to communicating, so that we don't automatically fall into the old patterns, for example, of instant messaging or email. And it's stuff that we will all be really familiar with, but when we're under pressure, we can default to certain communication channels. So let me share that with you right now. So really interesting framework here based on complexity of messages and the relationship status we have with the individuals we're trying to communicate with. And this might seem really obvious, but when we're under pressure, we tend to default to certain methods. And this can have a real impact on the sense of connection that people feel with us when we're working more remotely. So for example, it makes absolute sense if I've got quite a new, weak relationship with someone. I haven't really worked with them before, but we've got a meeting coming up. I might send them a really simple email, for example. So if it's a weak relationship and it's a simple message, I might send them a really simple email about instructions to join a video call. That makes absolute sense. There's no way I'd pick up the phone to tell them how we do that. It would not be a good use of their time, nor a good use of my time. On the other side of the scale, however, if I were late for a meeting, for example, and I've got a really strong connection or relationship with someone, I've been working with them for years, it might make absolute sense for me to instant message them with a few words, running late, be there in 5 minutes. It can be short, snappy, but because I've got a relationship with them already, it's going to land appropriately. So the intention and the impact will match really appropriately. Equally, though, if I've got, for example, a relationship which is at that medium level, I've worked with someone before a few times, but we haven't worked together in depth, and I'm trying to, for example, I'm trying to have a conversation with them around feedback on research, which might be a reasonably complex message that I'm trying to get across to them. It would make more sense, wouldn't it, for me to either have a video call with them or pick up the phone, so that we can build a relationship and the sense of connection, and also manage the complexity of the message accordingly. If I have, for example, a weak relationship with someone where I've never met them before, but we're kicking off a major collaboration together, we're going to be working together for the next 2 years, for example, on a project that we've got funding for. So, and it's going to be quite a complex collaboration, that it makes sense, of course, for me to set up an in-person meeting. It sets us off on a good trajectory when it comes to the project, but it also helps build connections. And then equally, if I've got a strong relationship with someone and I've got a really complex message, I've come up against a problem on funding and I want to bounce some ideas, for example, off someone, I might pick up the phone to them. So that's in the top right-hand quadrant of our framework here. In the top box, I may pick up the phone because it's a strong relationship versus a weak relationship, and it's quite a complex message. So very briefly, just going to ask you to reflect and pop into the chat. What's your default? Do you default to email, instant message, or is your preference face-to-face? Let's just get a sense of what's in the room today for your default form of communication. And then we can think about what impact does that have on the relationship and the connections that we have. So what I'm noticing is a lot of email or a lot of instant messaging. And of course, that's absolutely fine. That might be our preference. It's fine. But have you ever been in that position where you've exchanged 4 or 5 emails and you're thinking, if only we'd have picked up the phone, we could have cracked this in 5 minutes? And you can feel very frustrated with the other individual because they keep coming back at you with further points for clarification. But if you had picked up the phone, sometimes we think email is quicker. And it isn't always. Sometimes it's easier to pick up the phone or have an in-person conversation. So again, as we've been doing throughout this webinar today, just inviting you to think about where's my default, and what impact might that be having on my team and our ability to feel connected as a whole team. So I'm going to move us on to the final of the 4 C's, and that is contribution. So there's been some interesting research around people's sense of contribution when we're working more remotely or in a hybrid environment. And it would suggest that people have a less clear view of the organization and the contribution their work makes to the organization as a result of working remotely. But there's a contradiction, because the research, this comes from some research by McKinsey in 2021, the research suggests that at a very senior level in organizations, then senior leaders are much more confident of their contribution to the organization. In fact, 83% of respondents in the McKinsey research said they were clear on how the work they did contributed to the organization and the impact it had. Whereas, interestingly, 85% of those in frontline or middle management roles were very unsure of how their work contributed to the greater good or to the organization within which we're working. So again, the invitation here is to think about, hand on heart, to what extent do my team and the people I work with feel, or are they aware of the degree to which the work they do contributes to the bigger picture within the organization? And the research would definitely say that physical distance, the physical distance created by hybrid working, can sometimes cause us to lose sight of what that contribution is. And as senior leaders, thus, there's a role for us to work a little bit harder on helping people understand and perceive their contribution. Now, I use contribution in a big C and a little c kind of way, because my sense of contribution in an organization might be different to your sense of contribution, for example. But let me give you an example of where this really broke down for me. During the COVID pandemic time, I was leading a team of psychological therapists who were supporting some major trusts to ensure people were feeling supported across the organization and they could show up to do their work. And we got this mandate down via email, which is we need to capture the number of contacts we had in the week with people. So I needed to capture an X for each person I'd had some kind of contact with throughout the course of my working week. Now, I couldn't see the relevance of this. And what was frustrating as anything for me was that my work was being reduced to an X in a box. And I really lost sight of the contribution that I was making in terms of my team and as an individual to the bigger picture of the organization, because nobody had helped me understand what this tick box exercise was designed to do. Ultimately, it was to show senior leaders that more funding was required for the team because we had an incredible workload. But that wasn't made clear to me, that task was about contributing to the bigger picture around funding. So we do need to do a little bit more work with our teams around helping them see the bigger picture on contribution. But back to my point around your sense of contribution can be different to my sense of contribution. I might feel that doing a good enough job and delivering my work to you and writing a really great research paper is contribution enough for me. For someone else, it might be the bigger picture around the impact on patients. So it is really important that we not just do the work on feeding back to people about their contribution, but we help them to share with us what contribution means for them. So, for example, I might be thinking that the work I do has no contribution to the patient outcomes, for example. But if you can help me understand how the work I do contributes to patient outcomes, then I'm more likely to be engaged perhaps in doing the work. So we have a real job to bridge the gap between the work we're doing as individuals and the purpose, the bigger purpose of the organization or our teams, for example. And let me share some examples of this in action. So in 2007, for example, there was a study done by University of Michigan call center workers, and they found that those who interacted face-to-face with donors could fund almost twice the amount of money than those who didn't. So they were working to get funding for a particular charity, and if they spoke directly to the donators, they were able to build a connection with them that, as a result, delivered more funding for the organization. Another way of thinking about this is, how do we use PPI, for example, so patient involvement in our work, and how do we communicate that back to our teams so that they can see the contribution that is made within an organization from their work. Another way of looking at this is, I know that pharma companies, for example, will regularly at conferences bring patients in to talk about the impact that their drugs, their medication has had on them and their lifestyle. And that can be really engaging for people, and it can help them re-engage with their work, for example. So for the final time right now, I'm going to invite you to think about what could you do? What one or two things could you do right in the next week or so to help you shine the light more on how your team members' contribution contributes to the bigger picture or the broader purpose of your team or your organization? So you don't have to share it in the chat this time, just 30 seconds or so, just capturing what are one or two things I could do more of to help me shine a light as to the contribution my team members are having on the bigger picture. So the question was, what could I do more of to help my team become more aware of how they contribute to the purpose of the organization or the team? So how their work contributes. And you don't have to share it in the chat. Just again, an invitation to, we might be really clear on how we contribute, but because we're working remotely, that may have become disconnected for people. Okay, an example of this in action, if ever there was one, that connects this sense of contribution with connection, the two last C's we've been talking about, is the following. It's just the gratitude email. And I want to highlight this on two factors. Firstly, the importance of just taking time to thank people and spell out to them the impact that their work has had on a particular change initiative in the workplace, on patient well-being, for example. So that was the first thing that can be a really easy fix, for example. So saying thank you to people for the work. But the second aspect of it, which relates to our point around communication and connection, is there's a huge difference between sending an email, which is quite a generic email like the one on the left-hand side of your screen here, from Robert to Jane saying, well done for getting this in on time. Let's chat next steps in our meeting. Let me know what you think. That's a world apart from somebody getting a personal note handwritten for Robert that says, thank you for going above and beyond this month. Your keen eye for detail, drive and analysis have helped you get the project over the line. And I really appreciate your humor throughout it all. I don't know about you, but I certainly would feel more of a connection with the Robert that sent me the handwritten note than the Robert that sent me the email. I'm grateful for him sending it to me, but it puts a smile on my face to receive a note that is so personal and also will have taken time to write and send. So don't underestimate the power of the small initiatives, the small things that you can do to say thank you to people and highlight the contribution that they are making to your teams. Incredibly important when it comes to hybrid working. So in summary, very quickly, what we've explored today are the 4 C's that are really critical to effectiveness when it comes to hybrid working. The first is around comfort. So making hybrid working work for us, whatever our preferences, and also for our team. And equally, us being comfortable with others working in a hybrid fashion in their way rather than in our way. The second point was about creating a community united around a shared perspective. So often it gets forgotten when we're incredibly busy. We have our heads down doing the day-to-day work. To what extent do we take time out to build community, to thank each other, to come together informally rather than just for formal meetings? The third point was around connections, so building and maintaining strong connections between teams. So not defaulting to the email and the IM. I know we all have our preferences, but sometimes changing it up depending on the preferences of the individual that we're working with and the complexity of the message that we're speaking to. And the final point then is ensuring that everyone feels they matter and are able to flourish when it comes to their contribution. So taking the time out before launching into the next thing to say thank you, to help them see how whatever they were doing contributed to the bigger picture, and also understanding what contribution means for them. So thank you for your attention and focus today. Just signposting some more material if you're interested in it around this subject. So some material to read, to listen to, and to watch. In particular, for example, the 4 ways to make hybrid working work better for everyone, and maybe listening to Dr. Daryl Stickle talking about building trust in a hybrid workplace. So finally, before we close this session, there may well be questions that you want to ask around hybrid working. So Lucy, I know you've been working incredibly hard in the background capturing the questions.
No worries, thank you, Jean. So thank you for delivering such a thought-provoking session there. We will now open up the Q&A. So we've had a couple of questions come through in the meantime, but there's still time for you to send your questions by clicking on the Q&A button. You can send the questioners to us anonymously if you'd like to, and upvote on the existing ones you want answering first by clicking on the thumb icon as well. So I'm just going to look through and theme the questions and pull out the most upvoted one at the moment. So the most upvoted question at the moment, Jean, is how do I respond if my team members' remote working conditions aren't ideal?
It's a really interesting one, and it's one we saw a lot of, didn't we, during the pandemic, where people were sharing their workspace with family, young children, for example, and we don't all have the luxury of a private workspace at home, do we? I guess the big thing for me, I go back to Michael West, Lucy, who talks about compassionate leadership and having empathy for that situation and really taking time out to understand the individual situation and what is it they mean by it isn't ideal. So if it's around technology, how can we support them on that front? If it's around not having the private space, how can we work with them to find space in the physical working environment that they might have to share with someone else, but at least allows them to do their best work? For me, this is something I feel we ought to review on an annual basis, Lucy. I think as part of our process of setting our goals and objectives for the year ahead, as individuals and as teams, I think it's really important that we talk about climate and environment and have that conversation with people and review it regularly. What's working, what's not working, what can we tweak, can we not tweak? But that's where trust comes into it. If we've got trust in that relationship, people will be honest with us about the environment that they've got or not got, and then we can do what's in our power, hopefully, to help them. Because just because it works for us doesn't mean it works for everyone else.
Absolutely, thank you, Jean. That's great. We'll move on to the next question. So how is it best to react when people are skeptical about hybrid working, Jean?
When people are skeptical, do you know, I think it's kind of similar, Lucy. I feel that it's all about having open communication, and it's about not necessarily setting things as fixed. That we can come back to it again, we can review it on a regular basis. We can, as a team, discuss openly. If we've got trust in a team and psychological safety, we can discuss openly what's working and what's not working. But overall, I invite people to remain curious and try it. Give it a go. If someone's skeptical and they haven't tried it, I'm going to have a different response to someone who has tried it and is skeptical, because then I can work with them to see what is or isn't working for them. Does that make sense?
Perfect. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
So next question in the Q&A box, could you give a specific example of how leaders can effectively build trust in a hybrid team, especially when faced with challenges like resentment?
Trust isn't an easy one to build, but the biggest piece, if you look at the trust equation that Meister Green and Galford talked about, is that the biggest piece is around being curious and interested in other people. And one of the things that can fuel resentment, Lucy, is a sense of injustice or unfairness, that someone might be being treated differently to me. And I think that's where, again, open communication is really important. I think there is a little bit of a factor that if you were in the workplace, you are more visible, and sometimes opportunities come your way. And some people can't be in the workplace in the same way. So for me, it's about very open communication. It's about speaking as a team about what's working and what's not working. And I do believe that we have to come at hybrid working and teamwork in general with a sense of fairness and justice, because if people feel like they're missing out, then we're not going to get the best work out of them, and that can fuel resentment. So again, it all comes down to communication to me, Lucy. It's regularly checking in with people, the beginning, performance reviews, setting objectives. It's too often we're in meetings that are project related meetings, they're action oriented meetings. They're not talking about how we're working together. And we need to put those times in the diary as well. How are we doing as a team in our working environments? Are there things that we need to be doing differently as a team? So if we're not having that open communication, then resentment will be fueled.
Thank you, Jean. And I think this next question, like you said, there's very much a common thread in terms of keeping that curiosity and open conversations. We've got another question here just around how to manage it when you suspect that someone from, working from home in your team isn't necessarily, maybe doing as much as they could be in that situation. That approaching that with curiosity and keeping that conversation going. Is there anything else that you can add to that in terms of, how you might manage that with your team?
It's an interesting one. You're reminding me of a conversation I had with a client yesterday who has a member of his team who rarely shows up in the workplace. They kind of have a mandated 1 or 2 days a week in the workplace. And he said that there's a sense of injustice amongst others, that this person is being treated differently. And there's kind of a narrative around the business that he's not working as hard as he might do. My view on that is we have got to maintain an open mind. Because if we go in accusing someone without having data and evidence, then we are going to build resentment again. And that piece around the top of the trust equation, credibility, and in particular, reliability and intimacy, are going to be deeply affected. So I would do it very tentatively, and I would do it face to face rather than via Zoom call or whatever, because although Zoom and Teams have improved massively, it does not replace the face-to-face human connection. And when I have sensitive conversations to have with people, I much prefer to be face-to-face with them. And I will also maybe give them a warning shot about what I want to talk about. So rather than surprise them with it, which could put them on the defensive, I'm much more likely to go, as part of our conversation, what I'd love to talk about is working arrangements and how you're feeling in terms of what you're delivering and what you're not delivering right now. But I wouldn't avoid it. I would tackle it sensitively and with great empathy.
Perfect. Thank you, Jean. So we've got a question here just around, so those informal conversations and those, those direct conversations with your team. I suppose there's a question of sometimes those conversations are where kind of great ideas start. So just thinking about, obviously, a lot of those conversations, it might be fruitful to have it in person, but I think the question is around how can we capture this virtually? How can we make sure that in a hybrid environment, we're kind of encapsulating those really useful conversations if they can't always happen in a face-to-face environment?
It's a really great point. And I mean, I have to say, over the last few years, I've had some immensely creative conversations and inspiring conversations via Teams and via Zoom. I think the big thing is we have to create space for it. If we are back to back with meetings, either face to face or Teams, and we don't give people time to think and agendas are packed, then it's very difficult to be creative. So there are tools that Teams and Zoom have, for example, now that you can use to kind of prompt our creativity. But the biggest thing we have to do is give it space. And not pack our meetings with really intense agendas, not pack our diaries with back-to-back meetings that don't enable us to play to our strengths, like being creative. So create space in the diary for it. Creativity doesn't just come from nowhere. Any of those people you speak to around creativity will say, actually, we have to create the environment and the culture for it in the first place.
Perfect. Thank you, Jean. So we've just got time for one more question before we wrap up today. So that is, what if the outcome of my team's work is very disconnected from the work they do, and it'd be hard to show them the value of their contribution?
It's a really good question. And I suppose this comes back to my point about big C and little c, because in my one-to-one conversations with people, if it's hard to help them understand how their piece of work feeds into the bigger picture for much further down the line, it's actually me understanding them better and what makes them tick. And where they feel inspired by their work, or what excites them about their work. What does doing good work look like for them? So rather than thinking about it in the bigger picture of the organization, what does purpose and meaning and work mean for them? And it might be about doing a good enough job to be able to provide for the family, and that's what contribution means for them, rather than it's the bigger picture of purpose. But in order to be able to understand that, we have to ask the question and know people really well. So I wouldn't always focus on the big C. I'd also focus on what does contribution mean to the individual as a whole.
Thanks, Jean. That's a really nice way of looking at that. Thank you. So we will wrap it up there. So thank you so much, Jean, for delivering such a wonderful webinar. So hopefully everyone's found this beneficial and feels able to implement some of the behaviours we have explored today.